Hello and welcome to another episode of Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Today we will be discussing first the situation in Iraq as it unfolds. Reportedly, there are 319 people who have been killed since the protest started on October 1st. Now, this is according to reports issued by a UN and Iraqi Parliamentary Human Rights Committee. At the same time, we are seeing as the protests continue, the numbers are rising despite the international condemnation towards the way the Iraqi government has been dispersing protesters. Now, these 6 weeks that these protests against the government have taken place, they essentially started against corruption, unemployment, and the lack of basic services such as electricity and clean drinking water. Now, we also heard statements from the Iraqi Prime Minister a few days earlier, where Mr. Abdul Mahdi said that the government will make significant ministerial amendments, but the people are demanding a bigger change. What this change that they are demanding for and how the world is reacting to what is unfolding on the ground, we will be discussing with our guests today. Let me introduce who's speaking to us. First of all, we have Mr. Lawk Ghafuri, a journalist and reporter covering these protests for Ruda English, joining us from Erbil in Iraq. And also we have Ms. Belkis Wille, a representative of the Human Rights Watch right now in Beirut. Welcome to both of you to Newswire. I want to start with you, Lawk, to give us an idea of what is unfolding today and essentially also addressing the question that since the protest started on October 1st, how have they changed in their dynamics, in their demands, in the demographics of these protesters?
Yeah, so if we talk about like the protesters at the beginning, which has started the 1st of October, it started with a wave of people like going to the streets, mainly in Baghdad, then spread it to the other southern provinces of Iraq. But in Baghdad, the demands were like really basic demands. We're talking about fighting corruption, employment opportunities, and of course lack of basic services. They want more basic services. What happened is that the clashes started in the government responded to the protesters and the demands of protesters with violence, and we saw a wave of violence in Baghdad and other parts of Iraq due to the protesters. And by 9th or 8th of October, that protest kind of ceased or halted due to the huge amount of violence and let's say the way the real police and other masked gunmen have been using against the protesters. But it happened like it started again on 25th of October, and that's in this period till now it's still ongoing in many provinces and also the capital city of Iraq and Baghdad. And the way that the government responded, and until now we can see tear gas canisters, we can see bullets like live ammunition, we can see also snipers and even other kind of violence.
Now, there's an understanding that there's also a kind of a fear that has been established among the protesters regarding being picked up, not just being shot with live ammunition, but being up and vanished, sort of disappeared. We have heard of reports of cases, in fact, from a civil activist and also from Ruda Arabic, the sister company of your Ruda English. A columnist was also assassinated a few days back.
Yeah, so what is happening is that some forces or unknown, let's say, people are kidnapping the activists, especially and mainly the medic teams and activists who are in the Tahrir Square in Baghdad and other provinces trying to provide treatment for the protesters. We saw one of the cases which has really been circulating on social media is Sabah al-Mahdawi. She's an activist. She was a nurse and trying to provide treatment for the protesters who get wounded in the protesters. But then in one of the nights, she was going back home and she got kidnapped. Till this moment, the fate of Sabah al-Mahdawi is not known. And of course, the government had no statements regarding those kidnapped, including Sabah al-Mahdawi and others as well. There's a lot of reports talking about other people and activists being kidnapped as well.
So anybody who is critical of the government is in real fear that they will be picked up by unknown security forces or unknown people, and then their whereabouts are not known. But what about the statement that just came out on Sunday, where the President, the Prime Minister and the Parliament Speaker, as well as the Supreme Judiciary Council, they basically rejected and shunned this kind of security solution for peaceful protesting?
So we actually, if we go back to all the statements of the government, in every and each statement, the government have been warning and also urging that there is no live ammunition or any violence happening against the protesters. But on the ground, this is a different story, because we saw that we're talking about more than 319 people died since the start of the protest in October 1st. And that's happened for a reason. And if we talk about let's say the response of the government to the protesters, we need to talk about what are the methods that the government have been using. We're talking about tear gas canisters, I said, live ammunition. In the beginning of the protesters, in the beginning of October, there was also snipers. Till now, the second wave of protesters, till now, we haven't been there was no reports about snipers, but there is a huge amount of tear gas canisters being shot by the security forces against the protesters, and not toward the air or anything to disperse the protesters, but to kill them, to be honest, because it's into their body.
A lot of injuries we're hearing, a lot of deaths are occurring from injuries to the skull. Belkis, give us an idea of the kind of condemnation, the kind of acknowledgement that international organizations and world leaders are giving to what is unfolding here, because it seems a lot is happening politically behind the scenes, which also involves Iran quite a bit.
International organizations that are following the human rights situation have unanimously come out in condemning the excessive use of force by Iraqi security forces, the use, as was mentioned, of tear gas canisters being fired directly at people's heads in a method that is really not what they're made for. This is not about crowd dispersal. We see Iraqi security forces using tear gas cartridges as a method of lethal force, and we see them firing live ammunition. That has been condemned. The UN's mission in Iraq, the UNAMI assistance mission to Iraq, has been publishing numbers and tracking deaths. And we've seen some partners to Iraq, like the United States, the EU now on 2 occasions, and others issuing statements of condemnation of the excessive use of force. However, what we haven't seen is categorical condemnation by all of Iraq's partners, and that includes Iran is a huge supporter of Iraq's military establishment and security forces. We've even seen that some of the tear gas cartridges that have been used and have killed people were made in Iran, and we're really calling on Iran to condemn the violence.
That's really interesting, because the critics and analysts are saying that a big hand to play is Iran on what is unfolding on the ground. There's a lot of anger to why this political demand of a change in government can't take place. But tell us a little about Amnesty International has also come out and said that the government has to stop this bloodbath. You talked a little about the way they're using these tools to disperse crowds. There seems to be absolutely no accountability on what the government is doing to disperse these protesters.
The government is doing very little in terms of real accountability. We haven't seen any serious measures taken to investigate those officials in command control that have ordered the firing of live ammunition. We haven't seen any security forces punished for using tear gas cartridges as a method of lethal force. The government did release a report on October 22nd after the first round of protests, and that report had some really shocking details in there, that 147 protesters had been killed in the first wave of protests, 70% of them with lethal gunshots to the chest and to the head. After a report like that, you would have to expect very serious government action based on those findings, but we haven't seen that. Some commanders were simply dismissed or moved to another position, but nobody's actually been investigated by the judiciary, as far as we know, and then prosecuted.
There's also reports of women activists being harassed by unknown individuals who take part in these protests as fake protesters and then harass them afterwards, following them home. Do you have any further details of what other kind of actions the government might be responsible for in intimidating the protesters?
So there have been a range of measures of intimidation that we've seen directly from government representatives and then also by unnamed individuals, unnamed groups, where it's harder to identify who is really behind the threats. That has been including threats on, as you say, female activists, but it's much further than that. Anyone who's seen to be really playing a leadership role in organizing the protests and the protesters has been receiving threats. Sometimes it's as simple as messages over Facebook or on their phone, or death threats over phone. But sometimes we've seen abductions. Multiple activists have been abducted from the streets, some eventually released, some still not released. And there it really is a question about how much the government has been involved in these intimidation tactics. We've also seen these recently being spread directly to targeting medical staff. I've spoken to numerous doctors in the last week who've told me they were actually receiving personal threats for providing treatment to protesters.
Right. And coming back to you, Lawk, when this is unfolding on the ground, as Belkis also mentioned, the first report said 147 protesters were killed in the first wave of protests. That's a huge number. And with the kind of international outcry it's being seen, it doesn't seem like the presidency, the prime minister, it really makes any difference.
No, if we talk about like the casualties, it's unbelievable, and the response from or the actions by the government is still not meeting the requirements that's happening on the street. Like we're talking about the Parliament Human Rights Committee talking about like 319 killed. Right. And more than 12,000 wounded. But the government has done nothing to at least reduce this number, like reduce the violence that's happening on the streets. And
but in terms of the demands of the demonstrators,
we have to talk about the.
Lawk, sorry, in terms of the demands of the demonstrators, I mean, what started out for the basic right to life, basic amenities, employment, has now come to a clear out demand for a change in government and the government system. Are they also demanding a change of the constitution? Is the government showing any kind of indication they're working towards this?
So there is some indication that by the parliament today, the speaker of the parliament had some like a letter issued by him stating that all the, let's say, the international NGOs and the international human rights organization, they needs to be like in a meeting in the parliament to talk about the constitution amendment. But at the same time, the government is refusing to resign. The protesters' demands are really clear. They want to change the government. They want to the resignation of the government. But at the same time, the constitution, to change the constitution, or let's say to amend the constitution, is really hard because we have different political parties. Like even if we talk about the ethnicity, like background, like we have the Kurds. The Kurds are refusing to modify or amend the constitution at all. But at the same time, the government, like let's say, the government is okay to change the constitution, but at the same time, there's a lot of political parties who are not ready to change the constitution. And United Nations today, like yesterday, had a list of demands to the Iraqi government. One of them is if there is a change in the constitution, it should be through a referendum and decided by the Iraqi people.
And what are the realistic options right now? If the amendment to the constitution right now is looking very vague and far from where they're standing, what other options are there that would appease the protesters?
Well, it's really hard to figure out that, because the protesters have been protesting in Baghdad for more than 17, 18 days in a row. And there's a lot of change, not changes, but I would say a lot of promises by the government have been offered to the protesters, but nothing have changed. Actually, the protesters have been staying outside protesting. But if we talk in a way that what is the protester, what is going to satisfy the protesters, I would say the resignation of the government will be a huge step that the protesters will come or seize at some point, because the protesters, they will not stop. Either there will be huge crackdown by the government, so they're going to step back and they're going to leave Tahrir Square that they had the same strategy back in the first round of protesters in early October, or the protesters gonna let's say record a win by pushing the government to resign and make some reforms or snap election, let's say.
But is there any possibility that the military would take over? There could be a possibility of a coup, that the government could be completely dissolved. Is there any sort of understanding of that?
If we talk about a coup, it's not that possible at the moment, to be honest. But if we talk about a deal between the political parties and some regional countries, I would say yes, it's possible, and there are a lot of reports by different agencies that are talking about there's a deal between the political parties, including Sairun and Muqtada Sadr, and also Iran, let's say Tehran, that there should be a halt for the protesters and give Adil Abdul Mahdi, the prime minister, a duration or a period of time to make some reforms, real reforms, and ministerial reforms to satisfy the protesters. And in return, the deal includes that the protesters will be stopped, but I cannot confirm that. But there is reports about that. But at the moment, there's to this moment, there is no any let's say notices or signs by the protesters will stop.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Lawk Ghafuri, a journalist reporting on the ground, joining us there. Coming back to you, Belkis, the very nature of these protests that have been going on since October 1st, there's a understanding that this time round in Iraq, what we're seeing is there isn't much of a leadership here. It's not like one political organization or a activist leader is leading the protesters out on the street. Is that still the case now? Is that your understanding of what's happening on the ground?
Yes, there continues to be no clear either political movement or leader that's behind these protests. And as a result, every protester that I speak to has a different set of demands that they want to see met. And as a result of that, it's going to be actually quite difficult for the government to meet the demands of the protesters because there are so many different demands coming from so many different sides. I think this truly is a movement without a leader for the time being.
But it's interesting to note that Iraq, being one of in fact, the second largest producer of oil in the world, has also one of the highest unemployment rate here. These are predominantly the youth who are out on the streets demanding primarily a job and a better life.
Yes, Iraq is one of the richest countries in the world. If you look at the amount of oil that is extracted every day and sold on the international market, I think that's exactly why young people are so deeply frustrated that, in the last 15 years, they see very limited services. And one of the main things is a lack of jobs, a lack of a developing economy. Unemployment rates are extremely high. And that's, I think, why you see among the protesters themselves that the vast majority are, young men, the kind who are themselves most victim to this failing economy.
And it's a big concern, obviously, because this is the future of Iraq here, on the streets, unemployed, protesting a change from the government that doesn't seem to be very moved. I mean, we're hearing corruption reports. Last year, there was this huge scandal that 450 billion went missing. When you speak to protesters, is there an understanding that how they expect this will be resolved, or what will happen?
No, I think protesters, are making very specific demands. Some of them that have already been mentioned, like amending the constitution, amending the electoral law. But when you talk to protesters about how the fundamental root causes of the problem need to be addressed, the main one being corruption, I don't think anyone really knows how you tackle that. Corruption is so massive and so endemic in the entire political system as it exists that you would really need to talk about dismantling that entire system. And given the amount of money in the system, given the amount of arms and power that's caught up in the system, it's very hard to imagine how you would begin to sort of recreate that, removing this massive risk of corruption.
Now, you did mention that it's pretty much a leaderless protest, leaderless demonstrations. There's not one specific party responsible for it. But how does this work out when humanitarian organizations are trying to assist, because there's complete chaos in cities where these protests are taking place? Are there difficulties that they're facing in coordinating with those injured on the ground or those who are organizing these protests?
So the main type of assistance that's needed on these streets is really medical assistance. And as I mentioned, we have been speaking to medical teams and doctors in different cities, including Baghdad and in the south, that have said that they've been coming more and more under threat. Ambulances are being fired at with live ammunition, tear gas cartridges. I've spoken to numerous medics who've told me that their medical tents have been shot at or taken down by security forces. So they really are struggling in providing protesters with the type of help they need if they're injured, while at staying safe themselves.
All right, Ms. Belkis Wille there joining Beirut, giving us an update of the kind of situation, the difficulties that protesters are facing in coordinating with humanitarian organizations also, and how the chaos continues with over 300 killed. With that, we're going to take a short break here. We'll be coming back with an update on what's unfolding in Afghanistan. Welcome back to Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. We'll be talking about what is going on with the Afghan presidential elections, as results of the elections are expected to be further delayed after the frontrunner and main contender to President Ashraf Ghani, Chief Executive Mr. Abdullah, called for halting of the recount of the vote on Sunday. Now, Mr. Abdullah challenges the very integrity and the legitimacy of these already delayed electoral process. He's saying that over 300,000 votes are fraudulent. He's also withdrawn his teams as election observers from the recounting process ahead of Thursday's scheduled announcement of this preliminary result of the September 28th elections. Now, the country's Independent Election Commission has said that while they're still late in releasing results, they are going to go ahead. In fact, the recount as we speak is underway. Now, the turnout itself has been pretty abysmal for the presidential polls. In fact, it's been the lowest in any Afghan election. Only 25% of the population came out to vote. In 2014, a similar situation had occurred where there were claims of fraud and the candidates were fighting amongst themselves. It took the US to intervene. And again, like last time, the security situation was also perilous then and is now. We are getting reports of numerous airstrikes being conducted with the help of US and foreign troops that is killing Taliban fighters across the country. In fact, there has been an unprecedented death count of civilians also just in these past 11 days of November. So trying to understand how the situation is going forward with the chaos that is happening in the electoral process, as well as the kind of infighting taking place on the ground between US-backed forces and the Taliban. Let me introduce our guests who will be sharing insight on this. We have with us Mr. Hamdullah Hamdard, an analyst joining us from Kabul today. And we have Mr. Abdul Saadat, an analyst, also a former legal advisor to the president, joining us also from Kabul. Thank you to both of you for joining us here on Newswire. If I could start with you, Mr. Hamdard, trying to get a grasp of this situation where the recount is still underway, but the main contenders, in not just Mr. Abdullah, but also the Hizb Islami leader, Mr. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, is protesting against the legitimacy of the very election. How do you analyze this?
We cannot deny that the turnout of the voters was very low as compared to the 2014 elections, but it does not, it does not adversely affect the legitimacy of the elections. The elections are legitimate, and it's definite that the next president, will come with a very low number of the votes from the people. That's one side of the elections. The second thing is the recount that has started. The recount of the votes has started and it's still going on. And Dr. Abdullah yesterday said that he should stop the recount of those votes which they have not accepted as valid votes. And they also emphasize on the biometric votes only, and they want that not be counted. This is their claim, and they said that they will also issue their letter to the IEC. What should be done? Of course, one is the legal things that Mr. Satar Saadat is also here with us, and he has worked with the Complaint Electoral Commission. The process should go on. Dr. Abdullah and Gulbadin Hikmatyar and no one else can challenge the process. They should not stop the process. They should respect the votes of the people, and they should respect this democratic process if they really believe in democracy. Of course, in democratic elections, one has to win and the others will lose.
Okay, Mr. Saadat, let me come to you. While Mr. Hamdard has said that the vote of the people must be respected, but then at the same time, it is the vote of the people that should be taken seriously when there are concerns by contenders that not just one, but two, but multiple contenders, that there has been fraud, that there is a question about whether the biometric machines being used first time in these elections were even working properly. There are claims that many of them had been stolen, that they've been tampered with. Wouldn't it be, according to the law, to address these concerns first before announcing the final winner?
The process is going a little bit slower still, and it's a problem. Lots of people has concern that may this election face such challenge as election faced in 2014. But as Mr. Hamdard said, we have low turnout. Not even in Afghanistan. Even the history of democracy didn't experience such a low turnout in elections. IEC could handle this problem easily, but unfortunately, in the last days, they made some unfair decision, like they chosen double standards, like in parliamentary election, ex-commissioners made such a mistake, and now they are in prisons. Unfortunately, these commissioners made a political decision, because they shouldn't make decision that they will go to recount those votes which are not based on biometrics.
Because the law says that only biometric verified votes can be recounted. Is that correct?
Yes, Ghani's contenders and all candidates except Ghani, they insist that the votes must be valid based on biometrics. But now they are going to recount more than 2,000 polling stations vote. And those polling stations did not have a biometric device. That's why they boycotted the recount, and they think there is an intention for validating invalid votes. And it's a problem which currently has faced our election.
Okay, but so, Mr. Hamdard, we're talking about essentially a question of validity of not just 300,000 votes, as Dr. Abdullah contests, but also, let's not forget the 1 million, in fact, a little more than 1 million votes that the IEC itself has discarded over irregularities. And would it then be prudent to go ahead with the recount, considering that there are huge claims and concerns that seem to be legitimate that this process did not take place fairly?
I guess there were some mistakes made by the IEC as well. At the beginning, they took a very uncalculated decision, and they said that they will only count the votes which are biometric, and they did not even coordinate this decision with their local responsibles, the local heads of the IECs. They had to talk to their local staff first, and they had to make sure that all their biometric devices were working, and they could get all those biometric devices back. So this was the mistake IEC made at the beginning. And then they cancelled the votes that you mentioned, more than like almost 1 million votes, they were cancelled because they were invalid and they were not counted as valid by
no, but
IEC.
Mr. Hamdard, I think what I'm trying to ask you here is, Mr. Hamdard, that what would happen now? Considering that already this was such an abysmal turnout. There were less than 25% of the 37 million Afghans who came out to vote. And now, like Mr. Hikmatyar has said, that 44% of these votes are fraudulent. Dr. Abdul has given his claim. And many others have said that President Ghani has actually used state machinery and resources to unfairly to campaign and dominate the election itself. How does this move forward now?
The political game is on, and I want to explain this political game to you and to all the people who watch your TV. Dr. Abdullah and the other candidates are bringing Dr. Ashraf Ghani's votes down. Dr. Ashraf Ghani's final votes are 53% or something more than that, and Dr. Abdullah and other candidates are trying to bring more emphasis and to bring more pressure on the IEC to cancel or announce at least 300,000 votes of Dr. Ghani invalid, and so that he can bring Dr. Ghani under 50%, and the elections will go to the second round. This is the game. The main game is here, but the people and the political parties will not allow. IEC will not allow, Dr. Abdullah will not allow any other candidate to hijack this process once again and to repeat the game of 2014 presidential elections, as a result of which the 50-50 or the Afghan National Unity Government was created or established. People will not afford that anymore, and the IEC is asked by the people to announce the results as soon as possible, and especially on the date that they have said, which is 23rd of Akrab 1398.
Okay, so Saadat, let me also add here very quickly that any winner or the presidential winner would have to secure at least more than 50% of the vote, and if not, then this moves on to the next round. Mr. Saadat, do you agree with this analysis of Mr. Hamdard, that this is the political game as he defined it? We're trying to dominate Mr. Ghani and take away the 53% he has gained so far?
Actually, I don't know about that if President Ghani has won the election.
Right, these are unofficial reports, of course. These are unofficial, but based on what Mr. Hamdard is saying, do you agree that this could be a way to sort of delay, not just delay the process, but invalidate it for their benefit?
As I am aware, as Mr. Hamdard said, I have been worked there for 3 years as chairman of the IECC. There is not any winner still in our election. President Ghani had more than 58%, but when more than 370,000 votes invalidated, now he is under 50%. Abdullah claims that when IEC made decision to recount more than 2,000 polling stations, they intend to validate some votes to announce President Ghani as winner. But I don't know. Still, both commission didn't announce the result, and we cannot count on these information. But what's currently happening, I think we are going to face some more challenges, because it's okay, as Mr. Hamdard says, we have not any illegal problem here. IEC can go ahead and can recount.
Okay, Mr. Saadat, thank you so much for highlighting that. The more problems, Mr. Hamdard, that could possibly face at a time where just at the end of last month, we saw massive air raids, airstrikes by US-supported forces. There were over allegedly 80 Taliban fighters killed. And in just November, the first week of November, we've got reports of 29 pro-government forces killed, 34 civilians killed. The kind of violence that is escalating between the Afghan troops and the Taliban, the Daesh in Afghanistan, it really concerns the the civilians on the ground, how this kind of this political tussle over the votes is going to resolve the issue.
Exactly. Unfortunately, not announcing the results of the votes of the presidential elections has adversely affected the security situation of the country, and people are very much worried. We were also witness of such situation in 2014 when there was presidential elections crisis in Afghanistan, and then the 50-50 government was established. And still, for years, we witnessed that even in 1 year, a couple of years of the Afghan National Unity Government, 45,000 Afghan security forces were killed by both Daesh and Taliban, and of course Taliban were also killed. But this situation is as a result of this IEC decision pending situation. If IEC announces the winner as soon as possible, the situation will get better, and the Afghan government, the new president of the Afghan government, who will be who has to be committed to the Afghan peace negotiations with the Taliban, should start the Afghan peace talks, the intra-Afghan peace talks with Taliban in China. The situation will get better, and there is no doubt about that.
And at the same time, we're seeing the government talking about a possible prisoner exchange with the Taliban.
Exactly. The government is committed to exchange the prisoners and to release the Taliban prisoners just to show their act of willingness and their willingness towards the peace talks with the Taliban. And Taliban will have to do the same thing so that they can pave the ground for the intra-Afghan peace talks to talk with each other and finally have a result in this round of the intra-Afghan peace talks.
But at the same time, I said it wouldn't be helping that the US chairman of Joint Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, he's recently in an interview with an international news organization talked about how the US would continue to have troops on the ground, that the occupation of Afghanistan would continue for many, many years, something that the Taliban have come out and condemned this statement.
Once the Afghan government and the Taliban agree to sign the peace deal with each other, then the US and the US troops will not be authorized in Afghanistan to do any kind of operations without the willing and agreement of the Afghan government and the Afghan people, the Afghan parliament, and the Afghan political parties. That war will have to stop in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan will have to really become an economic hub for the Central and South Asia and for Europe in the world. That war has to end once the peace deal is signed between the Afghan government and the Taliban.
Essentially, Mr. Hamdard, there is a concern that already there was a lot of animosity between the Taliban and the incumbent government. With the kind of delay we are seeing in the electoral process, does this worry you that the situation on the ground in terms of violence is going to escalate and get out of hand?
Of course, if IEC does not announce the elections result sooner, the violence will escalate, and the security situation of the country is going to get worse and worse day by day. As in 2014, we witnessed that. And if if the IEC announced the results sooner, the Afghan government and Taliban will be able to start the intra-Afghan peace talks with each other, and they will be able to negotiate the peace deal and finally have a result in this round of peace talks, the intra-Afghan peace talks.
But considering that the Taliban had condemned the elections and announced the boycott, discouraged Afghans to even participate in it, that did play a big role in the low turnout this time round also. But so is this going to affect this delay, going to also affect how the Taliban have been dominating the scene in a way that the election turnout?
The war is going on against the Taliban. The Afghan government, the Afghan security and defense forces and the Taliban are fighting. The IEC's result doesn't necessarily mean that whether Taliban will dominate or the Afghan security forces will dominate. That will definitely depend on the war in the field, and who is stronger or who is doing the war more tactically. But the IEC has to announce the presidential elections result as well, so that there is a responsible government, a legal government, and the next president has to lead the Afghan security forces, and at the same time, the Afghan delegation for the inter-Afghan peace talks with the Taliban.
Do you have hope that whichever government comes into power, whoever wins the presidential elections, that there might be some sort of optimism on how the Taliban and the government finally the Taliban can see the new government as a valid government and not a US puppet?
Well, Taliban have to accept it. If there is the idea of who is the puppet of which country, that's not the solution. There is no puppet here, neither the Taliban nor the Afghan government.
Well, the Taliban have always said that the government was a US puppet because of the US intervention in the 2014 elections. But is there hope that this time round, without any US intervention, they would be taken more seriously?
No US intervention is welcomed in Afghanistan once again, and Afghan people and Afghan political parties do not want any foreign intervention in the presidential elections of Afghanistan. And the political parties are emphasizing on the IEC to announce the presidential elections without any foreign interventions in the electoral process. This time, people and the political parties will not allow any of the candidates to take these elections to the crisis and repeat the 2014 in Afghanistan, as a result of which many Afghan soldiers were killed and many civilians were killed during the last 5 years.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Hamdard, joining us there from Kabul. And we were talking about how the presidential elections are being affected with the delay. However, the Independent Election Commission has continued its process of recounting the votes. Today, we'll find out and keep you updated how that turns out. But right now, it's time for us to say goodbye. We will see you tomorrow with a new episode of Newswire. Till then, bye-bye.